Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? She devoted her days to saving lives, but returned every night to a silence that hurt more than any shift at work. When love turns to doubt, even home becomes a battlefield, and it is in this scenario that the truth, one day, decides to shout louder. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, London breathes by day and sighs by night. Between the buildings that touch the sky and the streets that never sleep, entire lives intersect without ever truly knowing each other. In this immensity of concrete and dreams, where every corner holds a story and every lit window hides a drama, lived Marianne Smith, a 28-year-old woman whose sweet smile concealed the exhaustion of someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Marianne was a nurse, not by chance but by vocation. Since she was little, back in the East End of London, where she grew up with her 3 older brothers, she saw the pain of others with the eyes of someone who wants to heal. Her hands, delicate yet firm, had held those of countless patients in the corridors of St. Jude's Hospital, where she had worked for 6 years. There, between night shifts that stretched into the early hours and double shifts that consumed weekends, Marianne found purpose. Every life saved, every smile coaxed from someone who arrived at the hospital crying, renewed her certainty that she was in the right place. But on that rainy Friday in October, as she walked through the hospital corridors with her belly already rounded by 6 months of pregnancy, Marianne felt a different kind of weight. It wasn't just the physical fatigue of long hours or the natural swelling of pregnancy. It was something deeper, residing in her chest and tightening her heart whenever she thought about going home. Home. The word that should bring comfort now sounded like a sentence. The 2-bedroom apartment in the Islington neighborhood, which she and Daniel had bought together 5 years ago, with so much sacrifice and joy, had transformed into the setting of a silent play where the characters no longer spoke, merely existing in the same rooms without touching. Daniel Henry Foster, her husband. The man she had fallen madly in love with at 22, when she was still studying nursing, and he worked as a sales manager at an electronics store. At the time, Daniel was everything a young dreamer could wish for. Attentive, hard-working, with that firm yet affectionate way of speaking that made Marianne feel protected. He promised her the world. He said that one day they would have a big house, children running in the yard, vacations abroad. He painted the future in such vivid colors that Marianne couldn't see the shadows that were already beginning to form. They married in a simple but moving ceremony at the neighborhood church where she grew up. Her brothers were there, of course. Robert, the eldest, serious and imposing at 38 with that navy blue suit he wore to important meetings at his construction company. Philip, the middle brother, at 35 with that analytical air of someone who sees numbers where others only see bills, already worked at a large investment bank. And Luke, the youngest of the brothers at 32, always smiling and modern, was already starting to find success with his app startup. The 3 walked their sister down the aisle with that mix of joy and concern that only older brothers know how to have. The first few years were good. Daniel was attentive, worked hard, and Marianne built her career at the hospital. They lived in a smaller rented apartment, but it was theirs, their nest. Gradually, they saved every penny for the down payment on their own apartment. It was an immense achievement. Marianne remembered the happiness of receiving the keys, how they spent the first weekend painting the walls together, laughing when he got white paint on his face, and she took a picture that was still saved on her phone. But life has a way of doing things. Colors begin to fade when we least expect it. Daniel, who had always been ambitious, began to get frustrated with his job. The promotions he felt he deserved didn't come. Commissions decreased. He came home later and later, more irritated, more distant. Marianne tried to understand, to support, to be the understanding wife she always wanted to be. But something was changing, and she felt it in the way he looked at her, or rather, in the way he no longer looked at her. It was a year ago that everything truly began to fall apart. Daniel got a new job, this time as a beverage sales representative. The salary was better, they said. He started frequenting bars and restaurants in the city, making contacts, closing deals. And it was in one of these places, a sophisticated bar in Shoreditch called Obscura, that he met Veronica Hayes. Marianne had never seen Veronica in person until a few weeks ago, when she happened to pass by that bar. But she had already heard about her. Friends commented, social media showed. Veronica owned Obscura, a 35-year-old blonde woman, always made up, always dressed as if she were going to a party. Her Instagram was full of photos from trips in imported cars at exclusive events. She had that air of someone who knows exactly the power she holds over the people around her. Daniel started mentioning her name at home. First casually, Veronica this, Veronica that. Veronica helped me close a big deal. Veronica knows everyone, in the city. Marianne, busy with endless shifts and trying to get pregnant after so long trying, didn't pay much attention at first. She trusted her husband, or wanted to trust, but the signs were too clear to ignore. The messages he hid, the phone calls he answered by leaving the room, the increasingly late arrivals home, always with ready excuses about extended meetings or difficult clients, and most importantly, the way he treated her. Where there was once affection, now there was coldness. Where there was once conversation, now there was cutting silence. When Marianne finally became pregnant, after almost 2 years of trying, she thought it would be the redemption of their marriage. She thought the news would make Daniel wake up, remember who they were, what they had built together. She prepared a special dinner, bought a tiny baby shoe, placed it in a small box and handed it to him, her eyes shining with hope. Daniel's reaction was like a bucket of cold water. He looked at the box, looked at her, and his face showed no joy, only surprise, and something Marianne couldn't decipher at that moment. Doubt, perhaps, or even annoyance. He mumbled a mechanical congratulations, gave a quick, cold hug, and soon made an excuse to leave. He had an important meeting, he said. He would be back later. Marianne stood there, alone in the apartment living room, holding that tiny shoe between her fingers, feeling the first tears fall in silence. At that moment, a painful certainty began to form in her heart. She was losing the man she loved, or perhaps she had already lost him a long time ago and was only just realizing it. The following months were a whirlwind of confused emotions. The pregnancy advanced, and with it grew the responsibilities and exhaustion. Marianne continued working because she had to, but each shift was harder than the last. Her legs swelled, her back ached, and the emotional exhaustion of a crumbling marriage weighed more than any physical symptom. Daniel became increasingly absent. He came home late when he came home at all. He barely looked at her. He barely asked about the baby. And then came the accusations. One night, about 3 weeks before that rainy Friday, Daniel came home late with a look Marianne had never seen before. It was a mixture of anger, distrust, and something that seemed almost triumphant. He threw his car keys forcefully onto the living room table and glared at his wife, who was sitting on the sofa with her hands on her belly. "We need to talk," he said in a harsh voice. Marianne felt her heart race. "Of course, about what?" she replied, trying to stay calm. "About this baby." Daniel spat the words as if they were poison. "Are you sure it's mine?" The world stopped. Marianne felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "What?" She could barely form the question. "You heard me," he continued, pacing the room. "You work at that hospital full of doctors. You're always on night shifts, you come home too tired to talk to me, and now you show up pregnant and expect me to believe it's my child." Tears came instantly. Marianne struggled to get up from the sofa, her belly heavy, her legs trembling. "Daniel, how can you say that? How dare you think something like that about me?" But Daniel didn't back down. In the following days, the accusations became constant. He questioned everything. He asked who she worked with, who her colleagues were, if she was involved with any doctor. Marianne denied, cried, begged him to believe her, but it was like talking to a wall. What she didn't know, couldn't imagine at that moment, was that these ideas weren't his. They were planted, carefully cultivated by Veronica, who saw Marianne as an obstacle to her own plans. Veronica had ambitions. She wanted Daniel for herself. She wanted to control him, mold him, use him as another piece in her game of power and appearances. And for that, She needed to destroy the image of the dedicated wife, transform her into a villain in her own husband's mind. Veronica was a master at this. In casual encounters at the bar, in conversations that seemed unassuming, she would drop poisonous phrases disguised as concern. "Daniel, have you noticed how distant your wife has been? Does she really still love you? Are you sure about this baby, aren't you? Because it would be quite a coincidence for you two to try for so long, and suddenly she gets pregnant just now, don't you think?" And Daniel, frustrated with his own life, insecure about his abilities, lost in his own weaknesses, absorbed every word as if it were absolute truth. It was easier to believe that Marianne was to blame than to confront his own demons. On that rainy Friday, Marianne was finishing her shift at the hospital when she felt a different kind of cramp. Nothing serious, just a discomfort that made her seek out Dr. Helen, the hospital's obstetrician and her friend. "Marianne, you need more rest," Helen said after examining her. "The baby is fine, but you're exhausted. Your body is crying for help." "I know, Helen," Marianne replied with a tired smile, "but I need to work." "You need to take care of yourself too," the doctor retorted firmly but affectionately, "and resolve what's consuming you inside. I'm not just your doctor, I'm your friend. I can see on your face that something is wrong." Marianne wanted to tell her. She wanted to open her heart and pour out all the pain she carried. But the shame was greater. How to admit that her marriage was falling apart? How to say that her child's father accused her of infidelity without any proof, without any real reason? How to expose her own wound? "It's all right," she lied. "Just tired." Helen didn't believe her, but she respected it. She just held her friend's hand and said, "Whenever you want to talk, I'm here." Marianne left the hospital around 7 in the evening. The fine rain falling over London wet her face as she waited for the bus. In her bag, she held the envelope with the latest ultrasound images. She had thought about showing them to Daniel, about trying one more time to reach him, to make him see the child growing. Who was his? Who was theirs? She arrived home almost at 9. The apartment was dark except for the living room light. Daniel was sitting on the sofa, but he wasn't alone. There was a half-empty bottle of liquor on the table. He looked at her with that gaze Marianne already knew and feared, the look of someone looking for a fight. "You're late," he said. "I had a shift, you know that," she replied tiredly, taking off her wet coat. "I know, a shift," he repeated sarcastically. "Who were you really with, Marianne?" "Daniel, please, don't start." She tried to walk towards the bedroom, but he stood up. "Don't start. I'm not starting anything. You started it." The argument escalated quickly. Marianne tried to show him the ultrasound images, tried to talk about the baby, tried to ask for peace. But Daniel was different that night. His words were sharper, his gestures more abrupt. He shouted accusations, she cried, denying them. And then it happened. In a moment of fury, Daniel got too close, gesticulated too forcefully, and Marianne, trying to step away, tripped on the living room rug. The fall was in slow motion. She remembered trying to protect her belly with her hands, hearing her own scream, feeling the impact of the hard floor against her body. And then just the dark void of unconsciousness. What she didn't see was Daniel freezing in shock. What she didn't hear was the neighbor from the next apartment, Mr. Jenkins, a 70-year-old retiree, dialing emergency services after hearing the screams and the sound of the fall through the thin wall. What she didn't feel was being taken to the same hospital where she worked, this time as a patient, not as a caregiver. When Marianne opened her eyes again, she didn't know where she was for a few seconds. The white ceiling, the smell of disinfectant, the constant beeping of monitors. Then the memory returned like a violent wave, and her hand instinctively went to her belly. The baby, her child. "Calm down, Marianne, calm down." It was Helen's voice. "The baby is fine, you are fine. It was a scare, but you both are well." The tears came forcefully. Marianne cried with relief, with fear, with shame, with pain. Helen held her hand firmly and didn't ask questions at that moment. She just stayed there, offering the silent comfort of a friendly presence. But the news had already left that room. It had already crossed corridors, left the hospital, traveled through phone calls, until it reached the ears of 3 men who were in different parts of the country that night. Robert was in Edinburgh, closing a deal for a new development. Philip was in Manchester at an investment conference. Luke was in Birmingham, visiting a potential investor for his startup. The three received the call almost simultaneously. It was Mrs. Carman, their mother, and Marianne's, the same woman who had raised the 4 children alone after their father passed away when Marianne was still a child. Their mother's voice trembled on the phone. "Your sister is in the hospital. She fell. She's pregnant. You need to come." No more words were needed. Robert cancelled his meeting for the next morning and bought a ticket for the first flight. Philip did the same. Luke got in his car and drove all night. When the sun rose on Saturday, the three were already on their way to London, each with a heavy heart and a growing certainty within them. Something was very wrong with their youngest sister's life, and they had let it slip by. Because in recent months, Marianne had distanced herself. Calls became rarer, visits to their mother's house decreased, and when they asked how she was, she always answered with the same "everything's fine," accompanied by a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They, busy with their own lives, their businesses, their problems, didn't insist. They trusted that their sister would seek them out if she needed to. Now they realized their mistake. On that Saturday morning, when the 3 brothers entered the hospital room where Marianne was admitted, her world changed. Not by their presence itself, but by what that presence represented. She was no longer alone. She had protection. She had support. She had a strength greater than herself. Marianne saw them and broke down. She cried as she hadn't cried in months. And there in that hospital room she knew so well but now saw from a completely different perspective, she told them everything. The accusations, the coldness, the distancing, the woman who manipulated her husband, the crumbling marriage, the loneliness that consumed her. The 3 brothers listened in silence. Robert clenched his fists. Philip mentally noted every detail with his analytical mind. Luke had tears in his eyes. When she finished, there was a moment of heavy silence. Then Robert, always the leader, spoke in a low but firm voice that left no room for doubt. "This ends now." And so began a new phase, one in which Marianne would no longer fight alone, one in which the pieces on the board would begin to move completely differently, one in which Daniel and Veronica would discover that they had messed with the wrong person. Because Marianne was not just a sweet and dedicated nurse, she was also the sister of 3 men who would move heaven and earth for her. And this story was just beginning. Daniel Henry Foster never imagined his life would come to this point. Sitting in a hospital corridor chair on Saturday morning, his hands trembling and his face pale, he tried to process what had happened the night before. The image of Marianne falling, the sound of her body hitting the floor, the terrible silence that followed. All of it replayed in his mind like a horror movie he couldn't turn off. He had called emergency services, yes. After the initial shock passed, and he realized the gravity of the situation. But when the ambulance arrived and took Marianne, when the paramedics looked at him with that mixture of professionalism and silent judgment, Daniel felt for the first time the real weight of his actions. Not just from that night, but from all the preceding months. Now he waited for news. The doctors had informed him that Marianne and the baby were stable, but they needed to keep her under observation. Daniel tried to enter the room, but a nurse, a colleague of Marianne's, whom he vaguely recognized from some hospital Christmas party, blocked his way with an icy stare. "She needs to rest," the nurse said in a voice that didn't hide her antipathy. "And honestly, Mr. Foster, I think it's best if you go home." Daniel wanted to argue, to say he was her husband, that he had a right to see his wife. But the words died in his throat. He knew deep down that he didn't deserve to be there. So he left the hospital with slumped shoulders and returned to the empty apartment where everything began. What Daniel didn't know was that his phone call hadn't been the first. Mr. Jenkins, the retired neighbor who lived next door and always greeted Marianne with a gentle smile when he saw her in the hallway, had called emergency services seconds after hearing the fall. And unlike Daniel, who omitted details, Mr. Jenkins reported everything. The screams, the argument, the loud noise that sounded like a fight. This information was already recorded in the incident report, waiting to be discovered by the right people. While Daniel sank into his own torment in the silent apartment, another person also couldn't sleep that night. Veronica Hayes was in her luxurious apartment in Kensington, lying on her king-size bed, compulsively checking her phone. Daniel had called her earlier before going to the hospital, telling her what had happened in a desperate voice. And Veronica, far from showing genuine concern for Marianne, saw an opportunity. She always knew Daniel was weak. From the first day he walked into Obscura as a beverage representative, she identified in him exactly what she was looking for. A handsome man, dissatisfied with his own life, with a wounded ego and easy to manipulate. Men like Daniel were her favorite type. They were predictable. All she had to do was feed their insecurities, make them feel special in her presence, and soon they would be eating out of the palm of her hand. Veronica's plan was simple but effective. First, separate Daniel from Marianne, then keep him close as another useful piece in her network of contacts and appearances. Veronica collected people like she collected accessories. A businessman here, a lawyer there, a sales representative over there. All serving her purposes, all thinking they were special to her, all discarded when they were no longer useful. But Marianne was a bigger obstacle than she expected. The dedicated, pregnant nurse with that irritating air of kindness was harder to remove from the equation. Daniel spoke of her with a mixture of anger and guilt that Veronica needed to transform, solely into anger. Hence the constant lies, the poisonous insinuations, the doubts planted in his head about the baby's paternity. Now, with Marianne in the hospital, Veronica saw the perfect chance to deliver the final blow. She already had a plan in mind, a set of documents that a lawyer who frequented her bar had casually mentioned in a conversation about complicated divorces. Documents that, if signed by the right person at the right time, could completely change the game. But Veronica was patient. She knew that timing was everything, so she kept her plans to herself and waited, while sending strategic messages to Daniel, messages that made him feel supported, understood, but also more confused and guilty. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Saturday morning brought 3 imposing figures who completely changed the atmosphere of the room where Marianne was admitted. Robert Smith, at 38, was the kind of man who commanded attention when he entered a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, always elegantly dressed even in casual situations, he had built an empire in London's real estate market. His company, Smith Enterprises, was responsible for some of the city's most coveted luxury condominiums. But behind the reputation of a ruthless businessman, there was an older brother who still saw Marianne as the little girl with pigtails he defended in the school playground. Philip Smith, at 35, was the analytical brain of the family. With a degree in economics from UCL and an MBA in finance, he worked as an investment director at one of the country's largest private banks. His ability to read people and situations was almost supernatural. He saw numbers where others saw only conversations, identified patterns where others saw only coincidences. And at that moment, as he listened to his sister tell her story between sobs, Philip was already assembling a mental puzzle of all the events. Luke Smith, at 32, was the youngest of the brothers and closest to Marianne in age. Creative, tech-savvy, always connected, he had founded an app startup that was already worth millions. He was impulsive where Robert was calculating, emotional where Philip was rational, and at that moment, seeing the purple marks beginning to appear on his sister's arm where she had tried to protect herself during the fall, Luke felt a rage he could barely contain. "Marianne, why didn't you tell us?" Luke asked, his voice choked, holding her hand. Marianne wiped, her tears with the tissue Helen had left. "I was ashamed. You all have your lives sorted, your successes, and I couldn't even keep my marriage working." "That's not your fault," Robert said firmly, but there was an unusual tenderness in his usually hard eyes. "None of this is your fault, Marianne." Philip, who had been quiet until then, just listening and analyzing, finally spoke. "Marianne, this Daniel, did he threaten you? Did he prevent you from doing anything? Did he control your money?" Marianne shook her head. "Not exactly, he just changed. And this woman, Veronica, I know. She's the one putting these ideas in his head." "Tell us more about her," Philip asked, and Marianne realized he was already in investigation mode. She told them what she knew. The bar, the Instagram full of ostentation, the poisonous comments Daniel sometimes let slip, quoting things she had said, how Veronica apparently knew details of their lives that could only have been told by Daniel. While Marianne spoke, Luke already had his phone in hand, searching for Veronica's profile on social media. He found it easily. The Obscura Bar's Instagram had over 50,000 followers, and Veronica's personal profile was there public, displaying a luxurious life that Luke, with his trained eye for digital business, immediately identified as too exaggerated to be completely true. "This woman isn't what she seems," Luke murmured as he scrolled through the photos. "Look, Robert, this photo here is on a yacht in Sandbanks, but the yacht isn't hers. I know the owner. It's Mark Thompson, that textile businessman who had legal troubles last year." Robert leaned in to see. "Go on," he said. "And here," Luke pointed to another photo, "this BMW isn't hers either. Look at the license plate reflected in the shop window behind it. It's a luxury car rental plate. This woman builds an image that doesn't completely match reality." "So she's a fraud," Robert concluded. "Not necessarily," Philip pondered, "but she's someone who sells an image to attract a certain type of person, and our brother-in-law seems to have fallen right into her trap." The three brothers exchanged glances. They didn't need to speak to understand what each was thinking. They would protect Marianne, whatever the cost. Helen entered the room at that moment to check Marianne's vital signs. She knew the brothers by sight from the few times they had appeared at the hospital to pick up their sister. She greeted them professionally, but when Robert asked to speak with her privately, she agreed. In the corridor, away from the room, Robert got straight to the point. "Doctor, as my sister's friend and as a doctor, I need to know, was this fall accidental?" Helen took a deep breath. She had a duty of medical confidentiality, but she also had a moral duty, and she knew Marianne well enough to know that her friend needed help. "Mr. Smith, what I can tell you is that your sister arrived, here with signs of extreme stress, exhaustion, and yes, injuries consistent with a fall. The baby is fine, thank God, but she needs rest, and more importantly, she needs peace. The kind of peace she clearly doesn't have at home." Robert understood the message. "Thank you, Doctor. She will have that peace. I guarantee it." Meanwhile, Daniel finally gathered the courage to return to the hospital. He arrived around noon, with a bouquet of flowers he bought at the nearest market, and a mental rehearsal of the apology speech he intended to make. But upon reaching the corridor leading to Marianne's room, he was confronted by three men he knew only from photos and a wedding 5 years ago. The brothers. Daniel felt his stomach churn. Robert was the first to notice his presence. The businessman stood up from the chair where he was waiting and walked towards Daniel with measured steps. Philip and Luke followed him, forming a human barrier in the corridor. "Daniel?" Robert said his name in a controlled but icy voice. "I think we need to talk." "I just came to see how Marianne is." Daniel tried to keep his voice steady, but it came out, shaky. "She's recovering," Philip replied, "from a fall that happened in her husband's presence. Curious, isn't it?" "It was an accident," Daniel defended himself. I would never." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Never what?" Luke took a step forward. "Never lay a hand on her. Never make her feel unsafe in her own home. Never plant cruel doubts about the paternity of your own child." Daniel paled. How did they know all that? "She told us everything," Robert said, as if reading his thoughts. "Every unjust accusation, every coldness, every moment you chose to believe the lies of a stranger instead of trusting the woman who always supported you." "You don't understand," Daniel tried to argue, his voice rising a tone. "You don't know what it was like. I was under pressure at work. Pressure at work doesn't justify destroying a marriage," Philip cut in with the precision of someone accustomed to disarming weak arguments in business meetings. "Professional frustration doesn't justify planting doubts about the fidelity of a pregnant wife. Nothing justifies what you did. And about this Veronica," Luke added, "we've already researched a lot about her. We know what kind of person she is. And we know you were manipulated. But being manipulated doesn't exempt you from responsibility, Daniel. You chose to believe her. You chose to doubt Marianne." Daniel held the bouquet of flowers so tightly that his fingers were white. "I want to see my wife." "No," Robert was firm. "Not today. She needs rest. She needs to recover. and she needs space away from you. You can't stop me from seeing my wife. Daniel tried to sound authoritative, but it came out only desperate. We can't, Robert agreed. But Marianne can, and she made it clear that she doesn't want to. Say you now. So I suggest you respect that and leave. Daniel looked at the three brothers. He saw determination in Robert's eyes, cold analysis in Philip's, and pure, contained rage in Luke's. He realized there was no room for negotiation there. So, defeated, he left the flowers on a chair in the corridor and left. Upon leaving the hospital, Daniel took out his phone and, almost instinctively, called Veronica. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft and welcoming on the other end of the line. "Daniel, my love, how are you?" And that word love was like a temporary balm for his wounded ego. He began to tell her about the encounter with Marianne's brothers, about how they prevented him from seeing his wife, about how he felt attacked. Veronica listened attentively, making the right sounds at the right moments, and when he finished, she sighed dramatically. "Daniel, I've told you her family always thought you weren't good enough for her. They're using this situation to push you away. You need to protect yourself." "Protect myself, how?" Daniel asked, vulnerable. "Legally, darling, you need to secure your rights, about the apartment, about the baby, about everything, because if you don't do that, they'll take everything from you." "But the baby isn't even born yet," Daniel argued weakly. "Exactly." Veronica used her most convincing tone. "And when it's born, if you haven't documented your rights now, it will be much harder. Look, I know someone, a very good lawyer, who can help you prepare some documents just to ensure you don't lose everything in this mess." Daniel, exhausted and confused, ended up agreeing. They scheduled a meeting for Monday, and so, without realizing it, he became even more entangled in the web Veronica was carefully weaving. Back at the hospital, Marianne had finally fallen asleep after so much crying and talking. Her brothers stayed there, taking turns. One would leave to get food or deal with an urgent work matter, but there were always at least two at the hospital. They weren't going to leave her alone. Mrs. Carmen arrived late in the afternoon, her eyes swollen from crying. The 60-year-old woman, small but strong, had raised 4 children alone after her husband died of a heart attack when Marianne was only 8. She had always been a warrior, always taught her children the importance of family, respect, and love. Seeing her youngest daughter in that hospital bed, pregnant and injured, broke her heart. "My girl," Mrs. Carmen whispered, kissing her sleeping daughter's forehead. "Mummy's here now." Robert hugged his mother. "She'll be fine, Mum. We'll take care of her." "I knew," Mrs. Carmen said, her voice choked. "I knew something was wrong. A mother always knows. But she didn't want to worry me, didn't want to tell me." "She'll tell us everything now," Philip assured her, "and we'll sort this out." That night, as London continued its frantic pace outside, inside that hospital room, a family gathered, around one of their own. And together they began to devise a plan. Not a plan of revenge, but a plan of protection and justice, because Marianne deserved more. She deserved a future where her child could grow up in safety. She deserved to be freed from the invisible chains Daniel and Veronica had placed on her. She deserved to have her dignity restored, and her brothers would make it happen. When Marianne woke up on Sunday morning, still in the hospital, she found Luke sitting in the armchair beside the bed working on his laptop. He smiled when he saw her awake. "Good morning, little sister. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice hoarse with sleep. "Researching," Luke replied simply, "about a certain bar owner, and certain inconsistencies that are appearing." "Luke, you don't have to do this," Marianne began, but he gently interrupted her. "Yes, we do. You're our sister, and no one messes with the Smith family without consequences." Marianne felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of no longer being alone. Outside, the storm was just beginning, and Daniel and Veronica still had no idea of the size of the hurricane that was about to hit them. On Monday, while Marianne was discharged from the hospital with a recommendation for absolute rest, Daniel was sitting in the law office of Michael Vance, the lawyer Veronica had recommended. The office was in a commercial building on Oxford Street overlooking Hyde Park, but Daniel barely noticed the view. He was too busy trying to understand the papers Michael placed before him. "So, Mr. Foster," Michael said with that professional, neutral tone that lawyers master so well. "Considering the delicate situation of your marriage, it is prudent that we protect your interests. Here we have a temporary separation of assets agreement, which essentially freezes any decisions about property until the situation is resolved." Daniel looked at the documents, his head confused. "But I don't want to separate from Marianne." Michael exchanged a quick glance with Veronica, who was sitting next to Daniel in a posture she had rehearsed to appear both concerned and supportive. "Of course not, darling," she said, lightly touching his arm. "But you need to protect yourself. Think about it. What if her brothers convince Marianne to file for divorce? What if they try to take the apartment? You worked so hard to achieve that." "It's true," Michael agreed. "And here," he pointed to another section of the document, "we have a clause about the provisional custody of the child when it's born. Considering that your wife is under the influence of her family and that there was an incident that resulted in hospitalization, it's important to document that you want to be present in your child's life." "But this will make it seem like I don't trust her," Daniel hesitated. "It's not a matter of trust." Michael argued with the patience of someone who had used this line of reasoning many times. "It's a matter of legal protection. If you don't document your rights now, you could lose them later." And there was more. Pages and pages of legal terms that Daniel barely understood, but that Michael explained with that confidence that made everything seem reasonable. At the bottom of the document, hidden among technical clauses, was the real trap, a power of attorney that would give Daniel powers to make decisions about common assets, but which, in fact, due to how it was drafted, could be used for much more. Daniel, exhausted and manipulated, picked up the pen, but something inside him, perhaps the last vestige of conscience, made his hand stop over the paper. "I need to think," he said, putting the pen away. Veronica's face contorted for a fraction of a second before returning to her concerned expression. "Of course, love, but don't take too long. These things need to be resolved while it's still early." Daniel left the office with the documents in a folder and a heavy head. Something wasn't right. He could feel it even through the fog of confusion that had dominated his thoughts in recent days. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Carman's house in the East End, Marianne was settled in her childhood bedroom. The simple but always clean and welcoming house was small, with 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a yard where her mother cultivated her plants. It was there that she had grown up, there that she had dreamed of the future, there that she had always felt safe. Robert, Philip, and Luke gathered in the living room while their mother made tea for Marianne in the bedroom. It was time to devise a real plan. "We need proof," Philip began, always the most methodical. "It's not enough that we know this Veronica is manipulative. We need to prove it." "I've already started investigating," Luke said, opening his laptop. "Her bar obscura has some tax irregularities. Nothing serious enough to close the establishment, but enough to raise questions. And what's more, I found 2 complaints on Trustpilot from former employees saying they were unfairly dismissed and that Veronica didn't pay all their severance." "That's useful, but it's not enough," Robert pondered. "We need something that shows what she did to Marianne, the manipulation, the lies about the baby's paternity." "There must be some digital evidence," Philip thought aloud. "Messages, audio recordings, something. People like her can't resist documenting their victories." "What if we find someone from the inside?" Luke suggested. "Someone who works or worked with her and is willing to speak." "That's dangerous," Robert warned. "If she finds out we're investigating, she can protect herself." "But if we do nothing, she'll continue to manipulate Daniel and destroy Marianne's life," Luke countered. Philip raised his hand for silence. "Let's do this. Divide the fronts. Luke, you continue the digital investigation. Robert, you have contacts in the real estate area who might know about her history as a businesswoman. I'll use my contacts in the financial market to see if she has debts, loans, anything that could give us leverage." "And me?" A soft voice came from the doorway. It was Marianne, leaning against the frame, her hand on her belly. "I want to help too." The 3 brothers immediately stood up. "Marianne, you need to rest," Robert said. "I rested enough in the hospital," she replied with a firmness that surprised even herself. "This is my life, my marriage, my child. I need to be a part of this." The brothers exchanged glances. They knew their sister well enough to know that when she used that tone in her voice, there was no point arguing. She had inherited their mother's stubbornness. "All right," Philip agreed, "but nothing that puts you at risk or stresses you out too much. Deal?" Marianne agreed and came to sit with them. And as they discussed strategies in that simple room, something changed in Marianne. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a passive victim of her own life. She felt part of something. She felt supported. She felt strong. In the following days, each worked on their front. Luke spent hours navigating social media, forums, complaint sites. Robert made discreet calls to acquaintances who frequented Obscura or knew Veronica professionally. Philip delved into financial reports and public records, and it was Philip who found the first big lead. On a Thursday evening, he called Robert, unusually excited for someone so generally controlled. "I found something. Obscura has significant debts. Veronica took out high-interest loans from a financial company that, let's just say, isn't the most reputable. She's in a much more fragile financial situation than she appears." "That explains why she's so interested in Daniel," Robert thought aloud. "If she can marry him, or at least gain access to his and Marianne's assets, it solves her problems." "Exactly. And there's more. I found out she's done this before. 5 years ago, she was briefly involved with a hotelier. The guy almost lost half his assets in a very confusing lawsuit before discovering it was all her setup." "Can you prove that?" "I'm working on it. I need a few more days." Meanwhile, Luke had his own discovery. He had created a fake social media profile and started following former Obscura employees. One of them, a young woman named Julia Mason, had posted several veiled comments about abusive bosses and toxic work environments. Luke decided to take a chance and sent a direct message. To his surprise, Julia responded, and more than that, she agreed to talk in person. They arranged to meet at a cafe in Shoreditch near the bar, but not so close that they risked encountering Veronica. Julia was 24, with tired eyes of someone who had seen more than she should for her age, and a story to tell. She had worked at Obscura for almost 2 years as an operations manager. She saw everything: the behind the scenes, the manipulations, the men Veronica used as chess pieces. "She's dangerous," Julia said, nervously stirring her coffee cup. "Not in a physical sense, but psychologically. She identifies fragile, insecure men and turns them into puppets. And when she no longer needs them, she discards them without mercy." "Do you know Daniel Foster?" Luke asked, showing a photo on his phone. Julia nodded. "I know him. He started showing up at the bar a few months ago. Veronica became interested in him almost immediately. I heard her talking on the phone once about him. She said he was perfect because he was married, had assets but was insecure enough to be manipulated. Would you be brave enough to testify to this? To tell everything officially?" Julia hesitated. "She can sue me. She can ruin my reputation. Or you can help prevent her from ruining other people's lives," Luke argued softly, "like she's ruining my sister's life now." And then Luke told Marianne's story. Julia listened in silence, and when he finished, there were tears in her eyes. "I'll testify," she said firmly. "But you need to protect me legally, and I need guarantees that she won't be able to harm me." Luke called Robert right then, and within hours, a trusted lawyer from Robert's company was drafting a protection agreement for Julia. She would be a witness, but would have all the necessary legal support. With Julia on board, the puzzle began to come together, but one crucial piece was still missing. They needed to expose everything in a way that was public enough so that Veronica couldn't simply deny it and continue her life as if nothing had happened. It was Marianne who had the idea. She was flipping through a magazine at her mother's house when she saw an advertisement for a charity event happening in 2 weeks, the London Business Gala, an annual event that brought together the biggest names in the London market, with press coverage and live streaming on social media. If you were living this story, would you have the courage to publicly expose your tormentors at an event like this, or would you choose a more discreet path? "Look at this," she showed the magazine to Luke, who was visiting. "Veronica always posts about this event. She tries hard to get invitations to appear in photos. It's the kind of place where she wants to be seen." "So what? Luke didn't understand what his sister was getting at. So what if we're going to expose her? Let it be on the stage she loves so much, in front of everyone she wants to impress. Luke's eyes widened. Marianne, this is risky, and very public. Exactly, Marianne said with a new determination in her eyes. She built a false image. We're going to destroy that image the same way it was built, publicly. The idea was bold, almost crazy, but the more they thought about it, the more sense it made. Robert, with his contacts, could get invitations to the event. Philip could prepare a presentation with all the evidence. Luke would handle the technical side, ensuring everything was recorded and broadcast correctly, and Marianne, if she felt she could, would tell her story. But you're pregnant, Robert argued when they presented the full idea to him. You can't expose yourself to that stress. I'm already exposed, Marianne replied, and I'll be exposed until this ends. I'd rather face it all at once than live running and hiding. Mrs. Carmen, who had heard the conversation from the kitchen, entered the living room, drying her hands on her apron. My daughter is right, she said firmly. Women in our family don't run from a fight. Never have. If that's how it needs to be, then so be it. And so the decision was made. They would go to the business gala. They would expose Veronica and Daniel in front of London's business elite. They would show the world who they really were. The next 2 weeks were intense. Philip worked day and night compiling evidence, documents, screenshots of conversations. Luke contacted known journalists, planting the seed that something big would happen at the gala. Robert used his influence to secure not only invitations, but also a spot on stage, disguised as a presentation about his company's social responsibility. Marianne, for her part, wrote and rewrote the speech she would deliver. She wanted it to be honest, emotional, but also dignified. She wanted other women going through similar situations to see themselves in her and find courage. Daniel, oblivious to all this, continued his confused routine. He occasionally visited Mrs. Carmen's house trying to see Marianne, but she always refused to speak to him. He called, sent messages, but received no reply. Veronica remained by his side, feeding his paranoia, telling him that Marianne's family was alienating her from him, that he needed to act soon before losing everything. On the eve of the gala, Daniel finally signed the documents Michael had prepared. He thought he was protecting himself. He didn't know he was signing his own sentence. The morning of the gala dawned with a clear sky over London. The event would take place that night at the luxurious Shard Hotel, with its futuristic architecture and privileged view of the city. Marianne woke up early, her heart pounding. In a few hours her life would change completely. For better or worse, she didn't yet know. But it would change. She chose a simple but elegant dress that accommodated her 7.5-month pregnant belly. She didn't want to look like a victim, but she also didn't want to look like she was trying to be something she wasn't. She wanted to be herself, just Marianne. The nurse, the pregnant woman, the sister, the daughter. The person who had been deceived but decided not to remain silent. Luke spent the afternoon making the final, technical adjustments. He had a USB drive with a devastating presentation. Every lie of Veronica's exposed, every manipulation documented, Julia's recorded testimony, statements from other people who had been harmed by her, and finally, the documents Daniel had signed, showing how he had tried to appropriate Marianne's assets while she was vulnerable. Philip reviewed everything with eagle eyes, ensuring that every piece of information was correct, every source verifiable, every accusation supported by concrete evidence. They could not leave room for questioning. Robert put on his best suit, looked in the mirror, and took a deep breath. He was used to doing difficult deals, confronting powerful businessmen, speaking to large audiences. But this night was different. It wasn't just business. It was his sister, his family, and he could not fail. When the 4 siblings and Mrs. Carmen entered the Shard Hotel ballroom at 7 in the evening, the place was already full. Men in suits, women in gala dresses, champagne being served in crystal glasses, conversations about business and investments echoing through the sophisticated environment. And there near the bar was Veronica, dazzling in a red dress that drew attention, surrounded by important men, laughing that practiced laugh she used to captivate. Daniel was beside her, uncomfortable but trying to appear confident. Veronica saw them first. Her eyes met Marianne's across the ballroom, and for a second, just 1 second, her mask slipped, and a flash of concern crossed her face. But she quickly recomposed herself, putting her confident smile back on. Daniel also saw. He saw Marianne, her belly evident, surrounded by her protective brothers, and something inside him tightened. A mixture of guilt, longing and fear of what was to come. The event began. Speeches were made. Awards were given. Dinners were served. And then, the moment. Robert had negotiated weeks earlier arrived. His company would be honored for a social responsibility project, and he would give a presentation. Robert went up to the stage with his usual composure. He started talking about civil construction, urban development, corporate responsibility. The audience listened politely, some already beginning to look at their phones. And then he changed his tone. "But today," he said, his voice echoing through the sound system, "I want to talk about a different kind of responsibility. The responsibility we have to each other as human beings. The responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to expose injustice, and to give a voice to those who have been silenced." The hall fell silent. People put down their phones. Something was happening. Robert gestured, and Marianne rose from her table and began to walk towards the stage. Each step was an act of courage. She could feel the eyes of hundreds of people on her. She could see Daniel and Veronica in the corner of the room, frozen. And when Marianne ascended the stage and stood beside her brother, her pregnant belly evident, her eyes shining but firm, the entire hall held its breath. It was time for the truth. Marianne held the microphone with both hands, feeling it tremble slightly. She didn't know if it was the microphone or her own hands. She looked out at the sea of faces before her. Powerful businessmen, socialites, journalists with cameras already pointed at the stage. And in the midst of everyone, Daniel and Veronica, who looked like salt statues. "My name is Marianne Smith," she began, and her voice came out firmer than she expected. "I've been a nurse at St. Jude's Hospital for 6 years. I work night shifts, help save lives, care for people in their most vulnerable moments. And 7 months ago, I discovered that I myself was living my own vulnerability." The silence in the hall was absolute. Not even the clinking of glasses, nor whispers, only complete attention. "I am here today because someone recently told me that women like us need to hide when we go through difficulties, that we need to carry our pain in silence, protect our shame as if it were our fault. But I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of feeling ashamed for something I didn't do." She took a deep breath, her free hand instinctively going to her belly. "5 years ago, I married a man I loved. We built a life together, dreamed together, fought together, or at least that's what I thought. When I found out I was pregnant after trying for so long, I thought it would be the happiest moment of our lives. But it wasn't." Tears began to roll down the faces of some women in the audience. They recognized something in that story. The familiar pain of broken expectations, of unrequited love. "My husband began to accuse me of infidelity, that the baby wasn't his, without any proof, without any real reason, simply because someone planted those doubts in his head, someone who had their own interests in destroying my marriage." Veronica visibly paled. Some people in the hall were already looking in her direction, making connections. Marianne continued, her voice growing in strength. "I worked exhausted shifts, pregnant with swollen feet, came home and found coldness, accusations, contempt. But still, I tried. I tried to save my marriage because I believed in love. I believed that people can change, can wake up, can go back to being who they were." She paused, looking directly at Daniel. "But some people don't want to be saved. Some people prefer to believe convenient lies than to face difficult truths. And some people," she now looked at Veronica, "specialize in creating these lies, in manipulating the weak, in destroying families for their own benefit." A murmur began in the hall. Robert stepped forward on the stage. "With your permission, I would like to present some relevant information," he said, and Luke, strategically positioned near the projection system, activated the presentation. Images began to appear on the giant screen behind the stage, screenshots of conversations, financial documents, public records, and the first image was devastating, a WhatsApp. Conversation between Veronica and a friend where she coldly described her plan to drive Daniel away from Marianne. The text was clear, with no room for interpretation. "This one is married, but he's perfect," one message read. "Frustrated with life, wounded ego easy to control. I just need to plant the right doubts about his wife and he'll fall into my hands." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Veronica stood up, trying to leave discreetly, but realized that all eyes were on her. She sat down again, her face red, mixing anger and humiliation. The presentation continued. Showing Obscura, Bar's debts, the loans from loan sharks, Veronica's pattern of getting involved with married men of means, testimonies from other people who had been harmed by her. And then Julia appeared on screen in a recorded video. "My name is Julia Mason," she said in the recording, "and I worked for 2 years at Obscura Bar as operations manager. During that time, I witnessed my former boss, Veronica Hayes, deliberately manipulate several men, including Daniel Foster. I heard phone conversations where she admitted to planting doubts about his wife's fidelity. I saw her instruct him to sign documents without fully understanding what he was signing. The event camera captured the moment Daniel put his hands to his face, finally realizing the extent of how he had been used. Philip came onto the stage at that moment, joining his brothers. "And there's more," he said in his calm but authoritative voice. "The documents that Mr. Daniel Foster signed this week, advised by Ms. Hayes and the lawyer Michael Vance, had hidden clauses that, if executed, would give him total control over his wife's assets, including the possibility of selling the couple's apartment without her consent." More images appeared on the screen. The documents in question, with the problematic clauses highlighted. And then the icing on the cake, an audio recording of Veronica talking on the phone with Michael, legally obtained by Julia, who still had access to some files before being dismissed. In the audio, Veronica's voice was clear. "When he signs, we have 3 months to execute before anyone notices. Split it 50-50, as we agreed. He's too stupid to understand what he signed." The hall was in complete shock. Journalists' cameras recorded everything. People took out their phones to capture the moment. Hashtags were already starting to emerge on social media. And in the midst of all this, Marianne took a deep breath and took the microphone again. "I am not here for revenge," she said, and her voice cut through the chaos. "I am here because I realized something fundamental. My silence was protecting the wrong people. It was protecting those who hurt me and putting at risk other women who could be the next victims." She looked around the hall, making eye contact with several women who looked at her with tears in their eyes. "How many of you have been through something similar? How many have been unjustly accused? How many have felt small, ashamed as if it were your fault? How many remained silent because that's what they teach us to do?" Hands began to rise across the hall, first hesitantly, then with more confidence. 1, 2, 5, 10. Women of different ages, different social positions, all sharing that silent pain. Marianne smiled through her tears. "So today, I break that silence, not just for myself, but for all of us. And to the women who are watching at home through the live broadcasts, I say, you are not alone. You are not weak for having been deceived, and you have the right to tell your stories." The hall erupted in applause. Women stood up, some openly crying. Men also applauded, many visibly impacted by what they had witnessed. The event had transformed into something much bigger than a simple exposé. It had become a moment of collective catharsis. Meanwhile, hotel security guards were already approaching Veronica, who tried to argue, shout, defend herself. But there was no possible defense against such compelling evidence. Michael Vance, the lawyer, had already discreetly disappeared from the hall, but cameras captured his hurried exit. Daniel remained seated, head down, his world crumbling around him. Robert descended from the stage and walked over to him. Daniel looked up, expecting anger, perhaps even violence. But what he saw in Robert's eyes was something worse, disappointment. "You had an incredible woman," Robert said quietly, for Daniel alone to hear. "You had a family being built, And you threw it all away because it was easier to believe lies that confirmed your insecurities than to fight for the truths that demanded courage. Daniel didn't answer. There was nothing to say. On stage, Marianne was being embraced by women who came up to offer support. Mrs. Carmen was there, proud of the daughter she raised. Helen, the doctor friend who had come to the event at Marianne's invitation, was also there, and Julia, who finally had the courage to appear in person, also came up and hugged Marianne. The cameras captured everything. Journalists were already writing real-time articles. Social media exploded. Hashtags like "Me Too" were silenced, and "Marianne, my heroine" began to go viral. What had started as the exposure of two specific people had transformed into a movement. In the days that followed, Marianne's story was everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, television shows. She was invited for interviews, for lectures, to participate in panels on psychological violence and emotional manipulation. Initially hesitant, Marianne realized that her story had power. Power to help other women, power to start difficult conversations, power to change narratives. Veronica faced legal consequences. The bar was investigated, her debts were exposed, and she ended up having to sell the establishment to pay compensation for several lawsuits, including one filed by Marianne. Michael Vance was reported to the Bar Council and had his license suspended. And Daniel had to confront the man he had become. A month after the gala, Daniel sought Marianne again. She was at her mother's house, 8 months pregnant, preparing the baby's room right there, as she had decided not to return to the apartment she had shared with Daniel. "Can we talk?" he asked from the gate, his voice heavy with weariness. Marianne came down and they talked in the front garden, under the watchful but discreet eye of Luke, who was inside the house. "I messed everything up," Daniel began. "I have no excuses. I was weak. I was manipulated. But that doesn't change the fact that my choices hurt you. They hurt our son." Marianne listened to him in silence. She no longer felt anger, only a melancholic sadness for what could have been but never would be. "I loved you, Daniel," she said softly. "I truly loved you. But the man I loved no longer exists. Perhaps he never existed as I imagined, and I need to accept that and move on." "The baby?" Daniel choked on the words. "Is he mine?" Marianne looked at him with a calm that came from a place of inner strength she had recently discovered. "He always was. You always knew he was, but you chose to doubt because it was easier than to trust, and now you live with the guilt of having doubted your own child." "I want to be a part of his life," Daniel said. "I want to be a father." "You will have that chance," Marianne agreed, "because I am not like you. I will not use our son as a weapon or punishment, but you will need to prove every day that you deserve to be present. You will need to rebuild trust, not only with me, but with him, and it will take years." Daniel agreed, tears streaming down his face. He knew he had lost his wife. The marriage was over. There was no turning back. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could be a decent father to the son who hadn't even been born yet. The following weeks brought changes. Marianne began working as a consultant for organizations that helped women in situations of domestic violence and psychological manipulation. Her movement grew. She had created an online support group that already had thousands of women sharing stories, offering support to each other, learning to recognize signs of manipulation and abuse. Her brothers remained present. Robert helped her financially to settle down, buying a small but comfortable house for her and the baby near her mother's house. Philip helped with the legal aspects of the divorce, ensuring Marianne received everything she was entitled to. Luke set up a website and social media profiles for Marianne to share her story and connect women going through similar situations. And Mrs. Carmen, the family matriarch, was prouder than ever. "My girl has turned into a lioness," she would tell her neighborhood friends. "I always knew she had that strength, she just needed to discover it." When Marianne went into labor on a rainy December night, she was not alone. Mrs. Carmen was by her side, holding her hand. Helen was the obstetrician, and her 3 brothers waited anxiously in the waiting room, nervous as if they were the fathers. Daniel was informed and arrived at the hospital, but stayed at a distance, respecting the space Marianne had requested. He would see his son later, when everything was calm, when Marianne was ready. After hours of labor, at 4 in the morning on a rainy Sunday, Gabriel Foster was born. 6 pounds and 300 grams of pure miracle. When Marianne held her son for the first time, looking at that small, perfect face, she cried. But they were not tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of unconditional love. "This one," she whispered to the baby, "will grow up knowing what true love is. Will grow up seeing his strong mother standing tall, fighting. Will grow up surrounded by uncles who love him, by a grandmother who is pure strength. And he will grow up knowing that no matter how many times life knocks you down, you can always choose to get back up." Gabriel opened his little eyes for the first time and looked at his mother. And at that moment Marianne knew that everything had been worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of pain, because everything had led to this, to that perfect baby in her arms, to that stronger version of herself. In the months that followed, life found a new rhythm. Marianne dedicated herself to being a mother and also to her work as a speaker and consultant. Her movement grew. She had created an online support group that already had thousands of women sharing stories, offering support to each other, learning to recognize signs of manipulation and abuse. Daniel kept his word to try to be a present father. He visited Gabriel regularly, always respectful of Marianne's boundaries. He was in therapy, trying to understand his own weaknesses and insecurities. It was a slow process, and he knew it would take years to rebuild any kind of trust. But for the first time in a long time, he was trying to be honest with himself. Veronica disappeared from the spotlight. The last news of her was that she had moved to another city, trying to restart away from the public eye and the scandal. Her bar had been sold, her debts paid, but her reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery in London. A year after the gala, Marianne was invited to give a lecture at the same Shard Hotel where everything had happened. It was an event on female empowerment and mental health, and she was the keynote speaker. Stepping onto that same stage, now with Gabriel in her arms during the opening presentation, while Mrs. Carman held him right after, Marianne looked at the packed audience. There were hundreds of women of all ages all there to hear her story and share their own. "A year ago I was on this stage for the first time," she began, "carrying the weight of months of pain, humiliation, and silence. I was pregnant, hurt, but most importantly, tired of carrying alone a burden that was never mine to carry." She looked at Gabriel in her mother's arms, who was sitting in the front row. "Today, I return here as a mother, as a survivor, as a witness to the power that exists when women decide not to be silent anymore. And I want to say to each of you, your story matters. Your pain is not your fault. And your courage to move forward, to stand up, to fight, that is what defines you, not the mistakes of those who hurt you." The hall erupted in applause. Women cried, hugged each other, and Marianne, watching it all, realized she had found her purpose. Not just in nursing, although she still loved the profession, but in helping other women find their own strength, their own voice. Her brothers were in the audience, proud as ever. Robert with his serious demeanor but teary eyes. Philip with his analytical way but clearly emotional. Luke, recording everything with his phone to post later and spread the message even further. And Mrs. Carman, holding Gabriel, looked at her daughter on stage with that mother's pride that needs no words. She had raised a warrior, a woman who fell but got back up, a woman who was silenced but found her voice, a woman who was broken but rebuilt herself even stronger. After the lecture, Marianne was surrounded by women wanting to talk, share stories, ask for advice. She listened to each one with patience and empathy. Some stories were similar to hers, others were different, but carried the same essence of pain and overcoming. A young woman in her 20s approached shyly. "I saw your speech at the gala last year," she said. "I was in a horrible relationship, thinking it was my fault, that I deserved it all. But when I saw you there, pregnant, strong, telling your truth, something changed in me. A week later I left, and today I'm here, rebuilding my life thanks to you." Marianne hugged the girl with tears in her eyes. "It wasn't thanks to me," she said. It was thanks to you I just lit a spark, but you were the one who had the courage to act. These stories repeated. Women who had left toxic relationships, women who had reported abuse, women who had returned to study, to work, to dream, all crediting Marianne with a part of their courage. And Marianne, humble as ever, redirected that credit back to them. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not one heroine, but a movement. Not one voice, but thousands. Not one story, but countless narratives of pain transformed into strength, of silence transformed into a scream, of victims transformed into survivors. When the event ended and Marianne finally returned home late at night, exhausted but fulfilled, she put Gabriel to sleep in his crib, kissed his soft forehead and whispered, "One day when you grow up, I'll tell you the full story. I'll tell you about the woman your mother was before you were born, about how she fell but got back up, about how the love she has for you gave her the strength to face what seemed impossible. And you will grow up knowing that no matter what life brings you, you always have a choice. The choice to get up, to fight, to live, with dignity." She left the room in silence and found Mrs. Carman in the living room, preparing tea as she always did on the nights she spent there helping with the baby. "I'm proud of you, daughter," her mother said, handing Marianne the cup. "I learned from the best," Marianne replied, hugging her mother. And there, in that simple house full of love, surrounded by her family, with her son sleeping in the next room, Marianne understood that she had found something that Daniel, Veronica, and all adversities could not take from her. Her own strength, her own identity, her own worth. The future was still uncertain. There would be challenges, for sure. Raising a child as a single mother would not be easy. Continuing her work of helping other women would require emotional energy that sometimes she wouldn't have. And fully processing all the trauma she had lived through would take years of therapy and self-reflection. But for the first time in a long time, Marianne looked to the future not with fear, but with hope. Not with shame, but with pride. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. As a warrior. As the woman who chose not to be silent, who chose to fight, who chose to get up even when everything conspired to keep her down. And that, in the end, was the most important victory of all. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Marianne's story has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by the journey of this warrior woman who transformed her pain into strength and her silence into a movement, leave your like right now. Subscribe to the channel to receive daily intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul. And tell us in the comments, what moment in Marianne's story marked you the most? Was it her courage at the gala, the revelation of Veronica's lies, or perhaps the birth of little Gabriel and the hope of a new beginning? We really want to know your opinion. Every day we bring narratives that move, inspire, and make you reflect on the strength that exists within each of us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will touch your soul.